My name is Agnes Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and this past spring, my son put my house on MLS without saying a single word to me about it. Not a phone call, not a text, not even a hint over Easter dinner 3 weeks before. On the last Wednesday of April, I came back from my morning walk along the lakeshore to find a lockbox clamped to my front door handle, the kind with a 4-digit code I was never given. My neighbor Constance was watching from her driveway in her housecoat, with that particular expression I have come to know, the one that means she has heard something about me that she doesn't know how to say. Welcome to Bold Mom Stories, where women who were written off get the last quiet word. If any of this sounds familiar, drop a comment, and please subscribe. The house is at 214 Birchwood Crescent in Oakville, Ontario. 4 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, and a sunroom my husband Arthur built in the spring of 1998 from salvage materials he drove down from a yard in Acton. We bought the house in September of 1986 for $147,000. The TD manager who approved the mortgage told us we were stretching. He was not wrong. We ate a lot of pasta that first winter, and we did not complain about any of it because the house was ours. 38 years I have slept in that back bedroom. In the summer of 1990, Arthur planted a mountain ash in the corner of the backyard near the fence. He chose the wrong corner, too close to the property line, and the roots have lifted the flagstone path every few years since. He always said he'd dig it up and move it properly. He never moved it. Every September, it drops its orange berries onto the flagstones, and I sweep them up and I think, stubborn tree, wrong spot, doing fine anyway. Arthur died in the spring of 2012. He was 63 years old. That tree has outlived him by 13 years. People ask what I did for a living. I tell them I worked at a law firm on King Street East in Hamilton for 31 years. That's accurate. What I leave out is the specifics, because the second you say real estate law, people's eyes go somewhere else. What I actually did was title work, searches, registrations, closing documents. I reviewed title chains the way some people read novels, carefully, in sequence, looking for the thing that didn't belong. I processed several thousand transactions before I retired in 2019. I know what a life interest clause looks like in a transfer deed. I know where to look for a registered revocation. I know what happens when a power of attorney is submitted at closing without anyone having checked whether it was canceled. Remember that. It matters later. On Saturday, April 7th, my son came over for brunch with a glossy folder and a box of Timbits. He's 48 now. He has his father's build and a habit of talking around the point in expanding circles until he arrives at what he actually came to say. He set the folder on the kitchen table and slid it toward me without quite meeting my eyes. Heritage Muse, Retirement Living and Memory Support. A silver-haired woman on the cover laughing at a garden bed full of flowers she had almost certainly not planted herself. Studios starting at $4,900 a month. Simone and I have been talking, he said. My daughter-in-law. He uses her name as a verb sometimes, meaning the conversation is already over. About how much house this is for one person. I have been one person in this house since April of 2012. Nobody raised the square footage as a concern in 13 years. I poured the coffee. He said the roof was due. It isn't. We replaced it in 2016, and I have the invoice in the filing cabinet. He said the backyard was more than I could manage. He said the stairs as though they were a hazard. There are 4 steps from the driveway to the front door. I walk 3 kilometers along the lake every morning. Then he said the sentence I have turned over many times since. He said it to the kitchen counter, not to me. She's not really tracking things the way she used to, honestly. I was standing 4 feet away with a coffee pot in my hand. I set the pot down. I let it steep. I asked him a question I already knew the answer to. Garrett, who did you speak to before you came here? He looked at the folder. That was the first answer. The second came a moment later. He said there was a man named Wayne, a senior transitions specialist, who had been very helpful. Senior transitions. 2 words that sound like a service and mean a displacement. I asked what I would be doing while we were not leaving money on the table. He tapped the folder. You'll be fine there, Mum. That's the whole sentence. 6 words delivered to a laminated photograph of somebody else's garden. Here's what I want you to understand about how that lands. It isn't cruelty. My son is not a cruel man. He is efficient, which I've come to understand is worse, because cruelty at least requires you to think about the person you're hurting. He said it the way you'd say the Rogers Center opens at noon. I didn't argue. I said, "Do you want more coffee?" He said he had to get going. He left the folder on my table. I read it after he pulled out of the driveway. I put it in the drawer beside the takeout menus, and I went outside and stood beside Arthur's mountain ash for a while, because I needed to be somewhere he had been. Now I'm going to be fair to my son, because the truth is more complicated than that picture, and it's the only reason what comes next makes sense. In the winter of 2006, Arthur was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. My son was 31 that year, had just been offered a site supervisor position in Calgary. He turned it down. He came home and he stayed, not for a week, not for a long weekend, but for 14 months. He drove his father to Juravinsky. He managed the insurance paperwork. He drove him to the YMCA on Monday mornings because Arthur refused to stop swimming. He sat in emergency at 2 in the morning without being asked. I have never once pretended that wasn't real. But here is what grew quietly in the years after. In the fall of 2008, the 3 of us sat in a lawyer's office on Main Street West. Arthur's idea. He did not want his son sitting in a state court for 2 years over a 4-bedroom house in Halton region. The lawyer explained the instrument. A transfer of the property into my son's name, with a life interest reserved for both grantors. The lawyer read the key clause out loud, reserving unto the transferors and the survivor of them a life interest in said property during the natural life of such survivor. My son initialed 3 pages that afternoon. He had his father's chair pulled close to his own, and he was holding Arthur's hand, and he was exhausted. He heard the sentence he wanted, and he stopped listening before the 2nd page. The house is in his name. That's what he took from that afternoon. He initialed the 3rd page without reading it. I watched him do it. I did not stop him. That choice has sat with me every year since. He has believed for 17 years that he paid for this house with those 14 months, and perhaps he did in one kind of currency, but not in the legal one. My daughter-in-law is 43. She married my son in 2001. She is not a careless woman, and she has spent 11 years building a case against me from a single afternoon in 2014. That year, she asked me to help fund an event design studio she wanted to open in downtown Oakville. She had done a real business plan. Some of it was good. I said no. I told her what was true. I don't lend money inside a family. I give or I don't. And I'm not in a position to give that amount. Accurate. Also, as I understand now, a very clean sentence to say to someone already braced for a refusal. In 2022, I gave my granddaughter Zoe $9,000 toward her first year at McMaster for nursing. My daughter-in-law found out at Christmas dinner. She smiled and said that's so generous, and then I watched her file it. Not as generosity, as a ranking. I met Wayne Hartley at a community breakfast at the arena in March. Good handshake. He spoke to me for 2 minutes and to my son for 25. In April, he showed up at my door with a clipboard and asked to walk the property. I let him in. He took photographs on his phone. He told me the roof was due, the same wrong information, the same original source. At the door on his way out, I asked him a direct question. I asked whether he understood that I lived here. He gave me a look I have seen on a lot of good men who have settled into a comfortable decision and don't want it reopened. Of course, he said. But the family coordinates these things, Mrs. Whitmore. He told me about his aunt, a house in Burlington, sold in 38 days after a fall. He said it was the kindest thing they ever did. He said it twice, and I believed that he believed it. That was the thing that made me careful. In early May, my son signed the listing agreement as attorney, in fact, using a continuing power of attorney for property I had signed in 2013, 2 years after Arthur died. My knee had needed replacement that winter. I had wanted my son to be able to act on my behalf if something went wrong. Wayne emailed me a courtesy copy. He CC'd me the way you'd CC a landlord. I printed it at the library on Navy Street for 13 cents a page. I read it at the kitchen table with Arthur's pencil. A yellow mechanical Stetler he used for site measurements that he'd had since the 90s. I underlined one line near the bottom, a reference to a continuing power of attorney for property, dated 2013. I put the printout in the drawer. I put the pencil back in the cup. The lockbox went on the following Monday. That evening, I went to the garage. Arthur kept a pair of bolt cutters on the wall above the workbench. I took them down. I stood in the dark with them for a while, in a room that still smells like motor oil and sawdust, and then I hung them back up. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was strategy. The bigger part was this. If I cut the lockbox off the door, my son would come the next day and put a new one on, and then I'd know for certain that the version of the next 8 weeks in which he changed his mind on his own was finished. I went back inside. I left the light on over the stove the way I always do. The lockbox stayed on my door for 10 weeks. Every showing, I could hear the shackle knock against the wood from the back bedroom. The stager moved my furniture without asking. Then my daughter-in-law arrived with flat-pack boxes and a label maker and the energy of a woman who has been waiting a long time to be useful in exactly this way. "We're just editing the space," she said. "Buyers can't see past personal items." Around 2 in the afternoon, I came out of the back hallway and found her holding Arthur's work jacket. Navy canvas, Whitmore construction, stitched across the chest pocket in gold thread, worn through at both cuffs. It had hung on the hook by the garage door for 13 years, because that is where it lived. She had it folded over her arm. She was reaching for a black garbage bag. "This one's a donate," she said. "It's in rough shape." I crossed the kitchen and I took it from her hands, gently. I just lifted it and she let go, and neither of us spoke for about 5 seconds. Then she wrote "sentimental" on a sticky note and pressed it to a box by the door, and I understood that I would eventually be in a box too, with a word on me. Birchwood Crescent is a short street. 19 houses, most of them built in the same 2 years in the late 1970s, most of them still holding the people who moved in before the internet. My neighbor Constance lives directly across from me. We have traded zucchini from our gardens for 26 years. The for sale sign went in on a Friday morning. By Saturday, the street had a story about me. Constance came over with a casserole and held my face in her hands the way you hold someone who has received news. "You just tell me," she said, "if it's too much." She didn't finish the sentence. I knew how it ended. The next week, the woman on the corner asked me if I was excited about making a fresh start. A man down the street said his mother-in-law loved Heritage Muse, said it with authority he had not earned. Nobody on that street asked me a question. They asked around me, and to me, with the answer already built in. By the end of May, I had become, on my own street, in the house I bought in 1986, a situation that was being managed. The open house ran on a Saturday in late May. Wayne texted me the night before to suggest I not be on site. Buyers feel more comfortable. Then a smiley face. So on Saturday morning, I got dressed, put on lipstick, and walked across to Constance's front porch. She brought out tea. We watched 19 groups go through my house. A couple in their 30s stood in my driveway discussing the sunroom. A man in a Maple Leafs cap opened my side gate for no reason. 2 women came out debating whether they could open up the kitchen. One of them said everything in there is original, and the other one laughed. At about noon, a family came out with a child of maybe 5. The boy ran at Arthur's mountain ash, the way small children run at things, grabbed a low branch, and a handful of leaves came away in his fist. He dropped them on the flagstones and kept running. His mother called after him. Nobody picked them up. Constance said very quietly, "Oh, Agnes." I said, "It's a tough tree. He planted it in the wrong spot and it never once minded." I did not cry on that porch. Not because I am strong, because Constance was there, and because by then I understood that everything I did was going to be filed as evidence of something. That afternoon, I heard my son through the cedar fence, talking to Constance. "The wind on our street comes down from the escarpment." He said, "She'll be fine there, honestly. There are people her own age. It's the right thing." and Constance said, "You're a good son." What got me wasn't the sentence, it was how smooth it was. No searching for words, no hesitation. "You don't get that smooth on the second try." He had been saying that sentence for months, to Wayne, to my daughter-in-law, to whoever gave him a tour of Heritage Mews, to everyone except me. By the time it arrived at my kitchen table in April, it wasn't a question. It was a press release. The decision had been made somewhere I wasn't, and I was just the last one told. If you have ever been the last one told, if your family has ever discussed your life like a project with a timeline and then presented it to you like a gift, you already know exactly how quiet a person can get. Stay with me. This is where it gets specific, and if this is landing close to home, take a second, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments who told you last. On a Thursday morning in early June, I drove to the Land Registry Office on Speers Road. Anyone can walk in off the street. You give them a name, a property address. A clerk shows you how to run the search. The parcel register on 214 Birchwood Crescent is public record. It costs $11 and takes one morning. The screen gave me the full chain. The 1986 transfer when we bought it, mortgages, discharged, a refinance, and then the 2008 transfer, and two more entries I had always known were there because I was the one who put them there. The clerk printed certified copies. She pressed an embossed seal into the paper at the counter. The first document. Transfer dated October 14, 2008. I read the granting clause standing at the counter, quietly, the way I used to read closing documents at my desk in Hamilton. Arthur James Whitmore and Agnes Ruth Whitmore, husband and wife, do hereby transfer to Garrett James Whitmore. All right, title and interest in the property municipally known as 214 Birchwood Crescent, Oakville, Ontario. Subject to and reserving unto the transferors and the survivor of them a life interest in said property during the natural life of such survivor. My son's name is on the parcel. He is on the property tax bill. He has been on it since 2008. He believes he owns the house. He heard one sentence in a lawyer's office 17 years ago and stopped listening before the second page. You cannot take something from someone you have been paying attention to. The second document I did not read at the counter. I folded it in thirds and put it in my bag. I drove home the long way down Lakeshore Road past the water, past the marina where Arthur used to rent a canoe slip he rarely used because he was always fixing something at home. I already knew what the second document said. I had watched it get signed. In the summer of 2021, my son came for dinner and asked 2 glasses of wine into the evening whether I had considered unlocking some of the equity in the house. He said it was just an idea. 6 weeks later, I received a letter from a private lender in Brampton thanking me for my application for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $130,000. I had made no application. He had used the 2013 continuing power of attorney for property. He signed my name with his own hand and 4 legal words after it, as attorney in fact. The application died before it closed, not because anyone flagged the irregularity, but because the lender's solicitor ran a title search and found a registered instrument on the parcel they couldn't clear. Their office sent 2 lines. Unable to proceed due to encumbrance on title. My son called me, annoyed. He said the lender was bureaucratic. He never asked what the encumbrance was. A closed door, and he walked straight past it. I went to the Land Registry Office in August 2021 and registered 3 paragraphs. A revocation of the continuing power of attorney for property I had signed in 2013. Registration number 2021 BR09341. Registered August 23rd at 9:14 in the morning. Any person dealing with this property is hereby on notice. I mailed my son a copy. Registered mail, return receipt. The green card came back 9 days later. The signature on the delivery line was a large looping S with a flourish under the A. My daughter-in-law had signed for it. She had received that envelope 3 years before she helped pack my dishes into labeled boxes. She never said a word. My granddaughter Zoe is 22. She is finishing her nursing degree at McMaster and working shifts at a surgical day clinic in Hamilton. She is the only person in my family who looks at a thing and then asks about the thing. She came by on a Tuesday in the middle of June with 2 coffees and stood on my porch and looked at the lockbox. Then she looked at me. "Grandma, what is that?" "I know what it is. Who put it there?" I told her. She sat down on the top step in her scrubs, and she cried, which I was not prepared for. She said she'd seen her mother share the MLS listing on Facebook with 3 red heart emojis and the words "exciting changes for our family." She said she'd called her father, and he told her to stay out of it. She said, "I'll come to the closing. I'll make a scene. I'll film everything." I said, "No." I told her what I meant. If you make a scene, this becomes a story about a family fighting, and every person in that room will choose the version that asks the least of them, the version about the elderly widow who couldn't let go. She looked at me for a moment longer than a 22-year-old usually looks at anyone. Then she said, "Okay, but I'm bringing you coffee every week until this is over." She did, every single week, without fail. That girl has never once talked about me in the third person while I was standing in the room. Now I'll tell you why I didn't simply refuse in April. 2 reasons. The first, I had seen what happened to a woman I knew from my old firm who had fought her daughter's plans loudly in her own kitchen over a raised voice and a broken mug. Months later, a capacity assessment had been requested through the Consent and Capacity Board of Ontario. The supporting documents described her as agitated and unable to accept appropriate assistance. She spent over $25,000 on a lawyer and won. She kept her accounts. Something in her also went quiet that never came back. When my son left the Heritage Muse folder on my table, I called a lawyer I had known from years in the field. A woman named Gail, who had done real property work for 30 years, and who charges by the 6-minute increment and wastes none of them. I told her everything. She said something I have repeated to myself many times since. "Agnes, if you fight him at your kitchen table, you lose. Not because you're wrong. Because a kitchen is not a room where what's written down is the final word. Pick a room where the record speaks." "I know exactly the room," I said. She said, "I thought you might." The second reason is the one I'd rather not say. I was still hoping he would change his mind. Every morning for 10 weeks I woke up and thought, today is the day he comes up those 4 steps and says, "Mom, I got ahead of myself. That's all it would have taken." 1 sentence, no apology, and I would have handed him coffee, and we would never have spoken of it again. I would have gone to my grave saying my son had a hard spring. So when people ask why I let strangers walk through my kitchen, the honest answer is not strategy. It's that I hadn't finished hoping yet. On a Friday in late June, a letter arrived at my mailbox from the real estate lawyer handling the buyer's closing. A routine notification sent to the property address advising the registered occupant that a transaction was proceeding and requesting confirmation of occupancy status for the title insurer. I sat on the steps of the sunroom Arthur built and read it twice. Then I laughed once, quietly, because I had been waiting for exactly this, and it had arrived through the ordinary mail, the way most important things do. I called Gail. I told her about the letter. She said, "You understand what happens at closing." I said, "Their lawyer will run a full title search current to closing day." She said, "And the life interest has never been discharged. Nobody's asked you to discharge it. Nobody has called you at all." Then she said, "Don't explain anything. Don't help them. They'll get there." I said, "I have no intention of helping." I ironed my good blouse the evening before closing. I set out my shoes. I put my driver's license in the outer pocket of my bag so I wouldn't be reaching for it at a table full of people. If you have ever ironed a blouse for a room where somebody expected you to be furniture, you know exactly what I was doing at that ironing board. Before I walk you into that room, do me a favor, hit subscribe and stay to the end. What happens next is the whole reason I'm telling you this. The closing was set for a Wednesday morning in July at the buyer's lawyer's office on Speers Road, 4 blocks from the Land Registry Office I had visited the month before. I arrived at 9:40. The office had a boardroom on the second floor with a long table and a water pitcher and a box of tissues in the center, because they know. The buyers came in first. A couple in their mid-30s, lovely and visibly nervous in the way people are nervous before something that genuinely matters. She had a folder with a listing printout paper clipped to the front. Their lawyer sat beside them. Wayne came in with 2 pens and told me I looked well. My daughter-in-law arrived with a travel mug and sat at the far end of the table. My son came in on the phone, ended the call, put his hand on the back of my chair without touching me, and said, "You doing all right, Mom?" The buyer's solicitor, a woman in her 50s named Anita, came in with a tablet, a closing package, and a title search printout flagged in 2 places with green tabs. She greeted the room, asked for identification, and began working through the transfer documents. Then she stopped. She set her pen down. She looked at her screen. Then she looked at my son. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you've signed as attorney, in fact. I'll need to verify the instrument. The CPU on file, our search has picked up a subsequent registration against it, a revocation. Document 2021 BR 09341, registered August 23, 2021. Wayne said, "That's not possible." "It's on the parcel register," she said. "It has been for 4 years. She looked at my son very steadily. "Sir, the power of attorney was canceled in 2021, which means the listing agreement signed in May was executed without authority. I can't issue title insurance on this transfer." The room went still. Then Anita turned back to the parcel printout and kept working, because that is what people do when they do their job properly. "The weather in a room does not change the checklist," she said. "There's a second matter, the 2008 transfer." She read the granting clause aloud, reserving unto the transferors and the survivor of them a life interest for the natural life of such survivor. She looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you the surviving life interest holder?" I said yes. She looked at my son. "Mr. Whitmore, this property cannot be conveyed while the life interest holder is living without her joinder and consent. I cannot clear title and I cannot issue insurance. Without insurance, the lender won't fund." My son stood up so fast his chair hit the credenza behind him. He said, "That's not right. The house has been in my name for 17 years. I've been on the tax bill." Anita said, "Registered owners of a remainder interest are typically on the tax roll. The right of possession stays with the life interest holder." He said, "This is my mother doing this, Mum. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything on this particular Wednesday morning. I did it on a Thursday afternoon in October of 2008, sitting beside his father in a lawyer's office on Main Street West, on the page he initialed without reading." My daughter-in-law said to the room, in the tone of voice used for difficult children, "Let's all just take a breath. Agnes, this isn't personal. You'll be fine at Heritage Muse." I opened my bag. I took out the Heritage Muse brochure, the one my son had left on my kitchen table in April, the one I had carried with me since, and I set it on the table face up so the buyers could see the cover from across the room. In white letters over a photograph of a garden, "You'll feel right at home." My daughter-in-law looked at it. My son looked at it. Neither of them had ever noticed, in 3 months of using that sentence, where they had picked it up. They hadn't even written their own line. I said 7 words. "I'm the life interest holder. I'm not signing." Anita was still working. That is the thing about a person who does their job with integrity. "Emotional weather doesn't alter the checklist," she said. "There is also the matter of the revocation notice and whether registered delivery was completed." I reached into my bag one final time. I placed a small green card on the table and slid it toward the center. Canada Post registered mail return receipt. Addressed to Garrett James Whitmore. The delivery signature in the box was a large looping S with a flourish under the A. My daughter-in-law made a sound like she'd stepped on something. Then she said, "I get so much mail." And she started to cry. I want to be precise about what she was crying about. She was not crying about me. She was crying because there were 6 people in that boardroom, who had just watched her sign for it. Wayne said, "With respect, the family makes these decisions." Anita, the buyer's solicitor, said the truest sentence spoken in that building all morning. She said, "Property law doesn't ask the family, it asks the parcel register." After that, it was mechanics. No title insurance means no funds advanced, no transfer, no sale. The lender withdrew. The buyer's agent asked carefully whether the life interest could be released. Anita said, "Only voluntarily, by the holder." Everyone looked at me. I stood up. I picked up my license and put it back in my bag. I looked at my son, who was still standing with a pen he had brought from home. I said, "Garrett, you get this house. You've always been getting it. You get it when I'm done with it, not one day before." Then I said good morning to the buyers, and I told them I was sorry, and I meant every word of it. I walked out of that boardroom, down the stairs, and I sat in my car in the parking lot on Speers Road for 4 minutes before I could get the key in. The transaction was canceled that afternoon. Here is what the next 2 weeks cost in numbers, because feelings are difficult to audit. The buyers were out $740 for an appraisal, $680 for a home inspection, and $380 for a rate hold extension with their bank. On the 12th of July, I mailed them a bank draft for wet $800 and a note that said, "None of this was your fault. I hope you find a house soon that keeps the things worth keeping." She wrote back 5 days later and thanked me. The listing came off MLS on July 8th, marked withdrawn. It cannot be relisted while I hold a life interest. That is not a threat, it is a registered fact. I filed a complaint with the Real Estate Council of Ontario about Wayne Hartley. Not about the deed, which he had no duty to catch independently. About listing an occupied property under a power of attorney he never once verified was still in force, and about never asking the occupant a single direct question about whether she agreed to the sale. His brokerage removed the senior transitions section from their website within 3 weeks. I reported the 2021 HELOC attempt to the Seniors Safety Line and to the Regional Elder Abuse Response Team. A social worker came to the house. She sat at my kitchen table for 40 minutes and read through the full envelope, the listing agreement, the escrow documents, the parcel register printouts, the revocation, the green card. She said, "Most of the time we get a phone call and a feeling. There is now a file. It isn't empty." On July 17th, I went to the garage. I took Arthur's bolt cutters off the wall above the workbench. I walked to the front door in the middle of the afternoon, with Constance watching from across the street, and I cut the lockbox off my door handle. 2 seconds. After 10 weeks of that thing knocking against the wood every time a stranger came through. Constance crossed the street and stood on my walk and cried and apologized, and I let her, because 26 years of zucchini buys you one bad spring. She said, "Not one of us asked you a single thing." I said, "No, but you're asking now." My lawyer sent my son a letter in late July citing the Substitute Decisions Act and the relevant provisions regarding financial abuse of a vulnerable person, noting that any further attempt to deal with the property without the life interest holder's written consent would be addressed accordingly. In early August, I went back to the Land Registry Office on Speers Road. Same counter, same clerk. I registered a designation of homestead and a new continuing power of attorney for property naming Zoe. I did not touch my son's remainder interest. Not one word of it. Arthur signed that deed with a hand already shaking from the disease, and it said exactly what he wanted it to say. I am not going to renegotiate my husband's last wish because his son had a difficult year. My son gets the house. He has always been getting it. He gets it when I am finished with it. Zoe moved into the spare room in August. She pays $50 a month and she handles the leaves in fall, which saves my knees. She leaves for her clinical rotations at 5:30 in the morning. I hear her in the kitchen from the back bedroom, the kettle coming on, the quiet of someone trying not to wake me. In September, I pruned the mountain ash back to where the branch had been strained. It came back the way it always does, planted in the wrong corner by a man who fully intended to fix it someday and never got around to it. Still standing, still dropping its orange berries on the flagstones every autumn. I am fine, I am in my home. My son and I speak a few times a year now. He has not apologized, and I have stopped waiting for that, the way I stopped waiting for him to come up those 4 steps and say, "Mom, I got ahead of myself." People keep telling me I outsmarted everyone. I didn't. I want to be clear about that because someone listening to this right now is doing the arithmetic on their own property. There was no trick. There was a public counter on Speers Road, an $11 search fee, a parcel register that any person in Ontario can access on any weekday, and a document my son initialed without reading at a lawyer's table in 2008, while his father sat 4 feet away. The only reason none of them found it first is that none of them looked. So here is the only thing I'll say, and I'll keep it to one line. They can decide what you are in every room except the one where someone reads the parcel register out loud. Go find out what is on your title while you still have the choosing of it. It costs less than a tank of gas, and it takes one morning. Drop a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.